On Fridays at 2 o'clock, we have our Shannon Jones, one of our education assistants, is doing this amazing chat where you can kind of interact with her and ask all kinds of questions. We have the Small Favors exhibition, which is completely online right now and really delightful, so please do check that out. We have the Clay National application for any artists out there who want to apply for the Clay National. That is coming up. The application's due May 25th. You can support us by shopping online. We are doing shipping about once a week, so safe shipping. You'll be able to get some new beautiful ceramics to use at home. And yeah, when we get back up online, there'll be lots of classes and things to do. So without further ado now, I want to thank Glenn Adamson for generously offering to do this talk with us today. Thank you, Glenn. We are really excited about his book, which I think is backwards to you guys, but Fewer Better Things. I sent links around so you can read the first few chapters. Please do buy The Real Thing. It is one of the few better things you should have in your house, I think. So welcome, Glenn. Glenn is a curator and writer who works at the intersection of craft, design history, and contemporary art. Currently, senior scholar at the Yale Center for British Art. He has previously been director of the Museum of Arts and Design, head of research at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and curator at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. Glenn's publications include Art in the Making, The Invention of Craft, Postmodernism, Style and Subversion, The Craft Reader, Thinking Through Craft. He contributes regularly to Art in America, Crafts, Disegno, Frieze, and the magazine Antiques, Other Things. He co-curated Vulcus The Breakthrough Years at MAD in 2016, which was a really incredible exhibition, as are all of Glenn's. He recently completed a biographical study of Lenore Tawney. He can tell us more maybe about this show that's going to be or is already up there. And then I'm really excited to talk today specifically about Fewer Better Things, but also to hear a little bit about Glenn's upcoming project, book, and exhibition that'll be on view, I think, next year. So Glenn, do you want to start out by talking, if you want to present a little bit about that new book that you're thinking about, and then kind of tell us, start with a little overview of Fewer Better Things, if you don't mind.
Sure. It's great to be here with all of you. Thanks, Jen, for having me. And it's great to see so many friends out there on the list of participants. I don't know if I've seen all the names, but Judith Schechter and Greg Moore, and I think Jen Scanlon might be out there, and Nora Atkinson, and many more. So it's an all-star audience. And thanks for spending the time today. I will say it's been very interesting to me the way that we've shifted all of our discourse onto this platform. And this is partly, I have to admit, a plug, but also just a reflection. I've started also this other series called Design and Dialogue, which we're now going to a 3 times per week schedule starting next week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern time, with leading designers. And this is something I'm organizing through Friedman Benda Gallery. And it's just been amazing to see the community reconstitute itself on a digital platform. And it seems particularly ironic to me that we're doing this even in communities that are unflinchingly dedicated to tactility and physical presence and materiality, what I call material intelligence, which is really the theme of the book of Fewer Better Things. So one thing I always like to say when talking about this book is that it's not really intended in any sense as a statement of Marie Kondo-like erasure of your junk. And the title, I realize, which is kind of a publisher's title in some ways, is really, it can be read that way. But what I'm hoping is that people will have, as a result of this conversation, maybe an understanding of the book really as a call to focus attention rather than just get rid of stuff that isn't worth your attention. It's the more positive aspect of it that I really want to emphasize. So in very brief form, the argument of the book is that we have lost touch, literally and metaphorically speaking, with our surroundings as one generation after another has become, on the one hand, less and less involved in material intelligence. And that's a term I'll get back to in a second, material intelligence. So on the one hand, most people are less involved with material intelligence. And on the other hand, those who are involved are more specialized than they used to be. So people that do deal with materiality, and here I'm thinking of anyone from an engineer to a doctor, to a plumber, to a builder, and even maybe some people that are operating in the craft realm, that the clay studio represents. Those channels of interaction with materiality have become narrower and deeper. And so what we're lacking is this communal and connective enterprise of engagement with materiality, and crucially engagement with one another through materiality. And that sounds a little abstract, but all I really mean is that things connect you to other people. And if you know more about the things, you probably will know more about the people who made them and the other people whose histories are caught up in those things. So when I say material intelligence, that's what I mean. I don't just mean like physics, like understanding how, an atom of iron is constructed and where it sits on the periodic table and how it might combine with other elements. That is, of course, one type of material intelligence, but the tacit knowledge, so-called, of a metalsmith would also fall for me under the heading of material intelligence. And to me, the great attraction of thinking in this way is that it illustrates that there are continuities between branches of knowledge that tend to be separated out in modern culture. And those, in fact, are two examples: science versus craft, but also art, also design, also philosophy, also engineering, also maybe even politics, history, poetry. And my, I guess, core argument in the book is that if we could embrace this idea of material intelligence as a shared foundation for people in many different walks of life with many different concerns and maybe even different political opinions and tendencies, which is something we might get back to, Jen, I feel like we could rely on materiality as a way of binding us together as a culture. So that's the sort of like 3-minute version of the book.
That's a great 3-minute version. And I think the fact that you ended with that idea that that this kind of this idea of knowing people through knowing what they can make and also what they treasure, I think, is another aspect of that, is a way to bind us together. And of course, one day someone's going to write the paper about how we use craft terms in physical craft terms when we're talking about concepts of craft, like bind and dovetail and things sort of coming together. I guess we don't talk about things getting fired into another realm, but there's some pottery term there too. Yeah, I can't help immediately think about the again, I know we're supposed to be talking about this, but I keep thinking about your talk that I heard recently about your new project and how people making things, within the realm that most of the people on this call today kind of operate within. It's this a particularly left side of the political spectrum, but in fact, there are lots of traditions across the board, politically speaking, people engaging in this kind of practice. And when you talked the other day, you were really talking about like quilting and sort of flag making, and it just so perfectly goes directly into the mask making that's happening right now.
Yeah.
And then the moment that we're in, the possibility of uniting in a way that it really, I think the last time this happened in the US, I don't know, I wasn't there, but during World War II, the fact that people were sort of banding together no matter what political stripe to kind of make things and save things and work towards the greater good. I'm totally going off the questions I said I was going to ask you, but just because you ended with that bind together, do you want to make any comments about that idea of like using this as a moment?
Yeah, sure. Well, just first to say the project that Jen is referring to is the book that I have coming out this fall, which is, I'm afraid, yet another book with craft in its title, which is a little bit embarrassing at this point. But the book is called Craft and American History, and it tells the story of American craft from the period of the Revolution to the present. So that was a big research project, and it's a book that took me a couple of years to write. So it's a you know, it's a synthetic history of craft in this country, and in particular, the way that craft forms the various identities of nationhood, particularly looking at four groups: the working class, often white working class, African Americans in a kind of general sense, Native Americans, and women. And what I'm particularly thinking there is that class, gender, and ethnicity are often articulated in relation to craft and vice versa. So that's really the emphasis of the book. And I think maybe for this crowd, it might be interesting to say that the book is much less anchored in art history and also craft reform movements than anything I've really done before. So it reads much more as a straight history of like labor unions and what it was like to be an enslaved artisan before the Civil War, and the role of craft in feminism, not necessarily feminist art, but feminism in general. So marked a real kind of departure for me in terms of research in a lot of ways. And I guess thinking about the present moment in light of all that work, I've been very, very struck, as you say, Jen, by the resonances with this that this moment has to previous moments. So the mask making, this is an obvious thing to say, I'm sure it's occurred to everybody, but the mask making is so similar to the like knitting on the home front during the Civil War, or victory gardens, or even in some ways building bomb shelters during World War II and after World War II. And I think one thing that you see repeatedly in these examples is that while craft is obviously not generally considered as a military technique, although, as I pointed out in the book, you could actually, in a funny way, say that the atom bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were handmade objects because they were virtually unique prototypes that were then used to kill all these people. So we might want to enlarge the domain of craft to think about examples like that. But when we're thinking about this kind of home front crafting, what you notice is that there's this very potent combination of individual self-reliance, pragmatism, and symbolism that's bound up in those gestures. So the masks, for example, to me, I see a lot of resemblances between the instinct to make masks and the instinct to make the pussy hats in protest of the Trump administration. And in fact, many of the networks that are being used to produce the masks are the same people kind of lighting up those same digital networks. It's also interesting that here is a good example of the digital and the analog being brought together, because of course digital techniques are being used to distribute the instructions for making the masks and distribute the masks. But also, and I actually just had a really amazing interview, so I'm writing something about this, as you might expect, about the mask making phenomenon. I had a really amazing interview yesterday with somebody called Danny Beasley, who's out in San Francisco, and he's one of the people that's connecting all the different maker spaces and artisans who are joining this effort to make not only masks, but also plastic face shields and gowns and other PPE, personal protective equipment. And the observation that he made was that among many other indictments of American culture that the COVID crisis has brought about, everything from our political leadership on down, and I'm sure you've all been reading a lot about that. He made the point that it also shows that fundamentally, if you don't produce most of what you consume, or even a large amount of what you consume, then you are going to lack preparedness for a crisis, almost no matter what that crisis is like. So he saw this as a kind of call to arms for us to sort of right size and get into balanced production and consumption, have more local production, more capacity, because in a way what he's doing is a miracle, but in another way is absolutely ridiculous that health professionals are reliant on these university fab labs to get them the supplies that they need. That just doesn't make any sense. So just using that as an example, admittedly a highly specific and highly charged example of how craft serves as a kind of linchpin of American identity symbolically, but also as a linchpin of preparedness or self-reliance or like literal safety for the population. And that's one of the many reasons why, and kind of a core reason why I think this idea of losing touch with craft is so pernicious, and was very much in my mind when writing Fewer Better Things as well.
Yeah, thank you. And that, I think, brings us really directly back to the book. And I was thinking about asking you for your favorite anecdote in the book, because it's so it's brought to life. The concepts that you think about are brought to life so vividly for the reader by your telling stories about your family and other people. And what you were just saying really directly goes into the story about the butchering of the animals. Do you want to tell
Yeah,
that story?
that's definitely the take-home anecdote. And I apologize because people might have heard me tell this story either over dinner or at talk before, because I love it so much. But it is a good story. So I should also say, Jen, as you're implying, this book is also very different from other books that I've written in that it does work a lot through personal stories, either my own or people that I've talked to. So there's a lot of what I might call homely anecdotes in the book. So it's
Mm.
very non-academic in a way, and was a real kind of change for me in that sense. So it's really, really different from, at least for me, it was very different to write this and write, invention of craft or thinking through craft. Very different exercise. Anyway, the story is that this is like in the 1930s sometime, and it concerns my great aunt Gail, who at the time was 13 years old. And so this is Depression era Kansas. And what happened was that she was sent to the neighboring farm to take care of it while the neighboring farm family was away. But of course, neighboring in this case means like 10, 15 miles away, right? And there's no electricity, there's no phones, there's no refrigeration, which are all important facts to keep in mind. So what happened was that on a hot summer day, the dogs on the farm chased the family's only hog around and around and around. And finally, the hog expired from heat exhaustion and literally was lying there dead in the dirt. And so Gail was faced with the question of what to do about this. And because she was a Midwestern farm girl of that era, what she did was to go and get a butcher knife, cut the pig into chunks that she could physically manage. Sorry if there are vegans in the audience. Dragged the pieces of the pig into the kitchen, then butchered it properly, and then canned the meat in a pressure canner. So basically putting it in mason jars. So when the family got back at the end of the week, there was Petunia the pig like on a shelf in the mason jars. And the best part of the story is that when she got back to my own family's house and they asked her how it had gone during that week when she was away, she said, fine. And she didn't mention anything about the pig. And it was only came up like a couple of weeks later when they all went to church and saw the other family that this had happened, because it was that unremarkable for her in a way. And I guess to be the point of the story is made abundantly clear if you just think about the 13-year-olds in your life, unless you have some very unusual 13-year-olds in your life. The idea that less than 100 years ago, the average kid would not only be able to do that kind of thing, but kind of would be expected to be able to, and also expected of themselves, and how much has changed in such a short period of time, I think just brings home what I'm describing as this loss of material intelligence. And a lot of the other passages in the book are anchored around my grandfather's experience. That would have been Gail's older brother, my grandfather Arthur, and his kind of omnicompetent upbringing, being able to make almost anything, fix a tractor, fix a fence, make ice cream by hand. And he ultimately became both a hobbyist woodcarver and an aircraft engineer. So he becomes this, for me, he's this, in the book, and also really for me personally, he's kind of a central symbol of what it means to be materially intelligent.
Yeah, I mean, that story is resonant with me, and I think with a lot of people. As you said, we can't imagine 13-year-olds practically like being able to do their own laundry, let alone
Mm.
I mean, we hope they can, but not all of them, let alone butcher a pig. Within, I'll just share that within my own family, my mom and her brothers and sisters grew up on a farm and did things like take the cows to pasture before school, which is not something that most people, even our age, can say that our parents were doing. So it's this, and then our lives are so different, and the idea that we have such a vast change in our society in such a short period of time also kind of helps to frame, I think, what's going on now in another way, that we need to be ready for these kinds of changes, and that when something so drastic can change in such a short amount of time, it can change back or in a different way.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Your comment about this book and the way that it's different from your other books, you describe it as, I think you said, less academic. It is in certain ways, but I have to say that I think it's, I guess, I guess I wouldn't describe it that way what am I trying to say? It is just as deep and just as important, but in a way that makes, I guess, it more accessible to more people, which I think is just so valuable. So I appreciate that you kind of reframed some of the things that you have written about and talked about in other places in this new way. I think it's just really important. And that your new project is really close to my heart, because I just don't feel has been an adequate marrying of craft and history. Like, we talk about craft history, but what we're really talking about is, it's the history of craft. But when you if you use the term craft history instead, I think the idea that those two things are parallel, and that we're using craft as the lens to look at history, again, is a way to make it more accessible and therefore more valuable to more people. And isn't that sort of what we're all, when I say we, like those of us in the craft field, many people on this call, we feel deeply that craft is valuable to our society, and we're trying to kind of constantly communicate that to a larger audience. And I think that that's really a good way to direct your focus. And people who are gonna, they're gonna pick up this new book, who would never have picked up one of your other books.
I hope so. That's definitely the goal. Although I don't want to kind of overlook the fact that the earlier books reached an audience in a way that I totally didn't expect, because they found a kind of art school audience, which was not necessarily what I set out to do, but somehow magically happened, and I've really valued that. However, I definitely feel like over the last few years, my thinking has taken a turn much more towards what you said, Jen, which is using craft as a lens to look at history in general. And I remember we were at Sarah Archer's wedding, and driving home on the way back, you were really encouraging me to write this book and not forget about the Philadelphia Centennial of 1876, which did get a long passage, by the way, in the book. And, I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that the studio craft movement, with its focus on just a handful of materials, clay, fiber, metal, wood, glass, and its relatively circumscribed demographics and pretty small institutional base, really is only a tiny piece of the story. It's like a shard of this vast edifice of craft history that you can go out and explore. I was really amused during my research to find out that Craft Horizons magazine, which of course we all revere now as this amazing early publication, especially when it was edited by Rose Slivka. And anybody who knows the ceramic history of that period will know the importance that Craft Horizons had at that time. But I can't remember the exact figures, but the total circulation of Craft Horizons at its height was something like 10% the circulation of Hot Rod magazine. because I was looking into hot rods, because I'm thinking, well, that's a great craft story, right? And also it like extends into the lowrider culture of Latino communities in California. And so I was looking into that, and I was just thinking, well, which is the more important craft publication then? Is it Hot Rod or is it Craft Horizons? Of course, they're both important in different ways is the answer. So what you're trying to do, or at least what I was trying to do in this book, is keep that all kind of in some sort of right balance and tell the story in a more, or like a less prejudgmental way, where it doesn't have to land in an art gallery to be important. And I feel like that's where the potency of craft really can be found in American culture.
Yeah, well, and to expand on that and idea of different important in different ways, you know, I don't mean to for one second suggest that your other and more, you know, as you said, academic publications are less important, because we need all of these different things in order to form a really deep and true understanding of just any subject matter. So the fact that we do have these wonderful, deep kind of PhD thesis level studies of things, and the things that are going to, you know, filter through kind of the art world and the other departments within the museums and the art schools, as well as now kind of thinking more broadly both about the objects that you look at and also about who you're trying to reach. I mean, at the Clay Studio, we talk a lot about audience, and we talk a lot, and as do all of my colleagues at all of your organizations, I'm sure, you know, why is this important? Why are we doing this exhibition or this project? Who is it going to reach? How many people's lives can we affect? And the idea that this, I think the same thought is being, you know, kind of examined through the publications really strengthens what we're doing as well, because it allows us to have something tangible to show to these wider and wider audiences that we're trying to address as well. So,
Yeah.
you know, every subject matter needs the whole pyramid, and I really appreciate the way that you have really at this point addressed a lot of the different levels within the pyramid, and you're very generous to talk about my encouragement of you, because of course this is your you know, your scholarship is really just something that I hold in extremely high regard. I'm glad to be able to talk to you about it.
Thanks. You know, can I just say a quick thing there, which is this, I totally agree with you about the multi-platform structure of thinking about craft and all the different communities that are tied together by it. And I do want to give a particular nod to the new generation of craft scholars that have come along in the last 10 years, which to me has been at least as surprising as the you know, more general embrace of craft in everything from corporate advertising to the maker movement, you know, craftivist protest. You know, there's so many examples of that. But I think not the least remarkable is this whole generation of academics that have come up. And we, of course, have the new master's program at Warren Wilson, also that Namita Wiggers is leading. So you have your first actual bespoke program on craft studies there. And it's been amazing to me to see that. You know, when we started the Journal of Modern Craft, which is now 12 years old, I think, we actually said in the first editorial that we had no illusion that we were going to be helping to found a sort of subdiscipline of craft studies. And then a decade later, we realized that that's exactly what had happened. And I think the journal did have some role in that, but I think there was also just this upswelling of interest in a whole generation of younger scholars. And that's been obviously really, really satisfying and fascinating to see. And it has also led to, you know, some incredibly innovative research that's very cross-disciplinary, very archivally intense, and also rethinks of what the archive can look like, you know, using oral history techniques, studio visits, history of science, history of technology, as well as art history, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you are then, it's circular, because these new publications, especially the forthcoming one, is one of the reasons I think it's so important is that it will be able to be used in university settings, college settings for undergrad students who really do need a textbook as the basis for, a real deep understanding of a topic, something that they can have this book, they can read it during class, they can examine it, and then they can have it on their bookshelf. And it's there really has not been something that is ties craft directly into history in a way that people can understand on that that entry level, which you can't have an ongoing field if you don't have new people entering. And I feel like this is going to help broaden that base of people who can kind of get into the field and then carry on, as you're saying, this really wonderful craft scholarship that's been happening. And it's pretty exciting to be kind of be able to watch that growing, since I got interested in the topic. And I think I started teaching craft history at Temple in 2005 or 4. Just I didn't even know it was a thing until they handed me the class.
It barely was then, and you were one of the first. So, and that's not that long ago. Obviously, that's 15 years. I mean, I'm sure there's like a whole range of generations in the audience here, and I'm probably about in the middle of it. But I am old enough to remember the look of combined pity and befuddlement in people's eyes when I told them that I was a craft specialist. Like some combination of like, why would you want to do that, and what does it even mean? It's changed so much. So that I just feel very fortunate to have been a part of that.
Yeah, I'll try. I shouldn't use the word vindicated, maybe, but it's like I went from history to art history to decorative arts to museums to craft, and I think my history professors really saw it as this like downward trajectory. But I think but here I'm doing okay, and I love it, so it's fine.
Speaking of fewer better things, this is my coffee cup here. This is Ellen Shanken, if anybody remembers that name. Virginia, I think, based potter. I might be slightly wrong about the geography. But I used to work at a place called the Clay Pot. After I got out of college, I had a desk job selling pottery at this wonderful Brooklyn store called the Clay Pot. It's now moved over to Manhattan. And I got
it's a jewelry store now, weirdly.
It always sold jewelry, especially wedding rings, when I was there too. But they also sold, as they had already in the 1960s when they started these, they were selling actual clay pots. And I've had this one ever since. So I've been drinking coffee out of this mug for like 30 years.
That's great. Well, I've got my, what I posted this morning, my Unamitsu Taguchi cup.
Maybe at the end of time we can have like box pot.
Yeah, everybody will hold up their mug. Okay, maybe we'll do one more question and then we'll open it up for other people, since it's just like you and I chatting and everybody.
Well, it's great to see the comments happening in the chat box. Yeah. So I totally encourage that. I think one of the great things about Zoom is that you can have that chat thing that's like the crawl on CNN, and so people can talk to one another while we're talking, which is really, really nice. It's actually a big improvement on a regular lecture.
I mean, exactly. There's so many good things to think about, like people who would never be able to join us normally. So I think right before we switch over to everyone else, I just wanted to read one of my favorite quotes from the book, which is, "As a culture, we are in danger of falling out of touch, not only with objects, but with the intelligence they embody, the empathy that is bound up in tangible things." And you touched on that earlier, that idea of material intelligence, but I think empathy is just something that we really, as a culture, don't pay enough attention to and don't talk about enough, but in fact is the thing that makes us successful human beings, the thing that can make us have a successful society. And can you talk a little bit about connecting the idea of empathy to material intelligence?
Sure. So, one of the reasons that I thought about material intelligence in the first place was because of this earlier idea that had come up really in business studies, which is emotional intelligence. So they were talking about IQ and EQ. So I was thinking about like MQ, material intelligence. And I guess one of the main points that I'm trying to make in the book is that objects are repositories of different kinds of intelligence. And it seems to me really ironic that these days we talk about our phones and then other technology as being smart. The implication being that only handcrafted objects that don't have any of that kind of interactivity programmed into them must be dumb. Dumb both in the sense of voiceless or mute, and also dumb in the sense of not as intelligent. So the idea here would be that like here's my phone and here's my mug, right? And the idea is that this is smart and this is dumb. And I completely disagree with that. I think at most you could say they represent different kinds of intelligence. Certainly the ceramic mug has a much longer repository of intelligence built into it, because you have to think about all the discoveries that were necessary for someone like Ellen Shanken to make an object like this. And that's a much longer trajectory than leads into electronics. Obviously, it's centuries, millennia old. But also, to your point, Jen, I think that one of the key differences between the smartphone and the supposedly dumb mug is that the mug feels to me like it's a repository of empathic intelligence, whereas the smartphone has a kind of brittle, narrow, technocratic, instrumental pitch or basis, and it seems virtually devoid of empathy, which I think is precisely why people can interact with those objects in the way that they do on Twitter and elsewhere, basically engaging in nonstop abuse and discord and divisiveness. And that's just not something you can do with ceramics. They don't have that affordance, as a design theorist would say, an affordance being something that an object allows you to do. So it exerts a kind of agency on you. And so for me, there's kind of 2 points there. One of which is that any really cunningly handmade object has in it centuries or more of human intelligence, like built up, almost like a battery being charged. And the other is that empathy and awareness of other people is built into that. And I'm just really struck by the way that craftspeople will associate specific things that they do, whether it's a particular glaze or a particular move they might make when throwing on the wheel or a form. They will associate it with people that they know and people that they've learned from. And there's that kind of hand-to-hand learning that is often bound up in craft. And I feel like, again, that's very, very difficult to replace with the kind of indirect dissociated network constructs that we tend to have through our smart technology. So again, this is not like a Luddite call to throw at the phone. And obviously we're talking right now over Zoom, and thank God for Zoom. So it's not saying that these things are worthless or that we should jettison them. It's just to remind the reader that it's not that these other objects need to be kind of pitied or treasured, or that we should have sympathy for them because they're so humble. Much the contrary, is that we should remember that those objects are just as smart, just in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to sound too like I'll indulge in magical thinking, but I always do anyway. So I also just think that there is a value in, even if you don't think of it as magical, it is the knowledge that somebody made this with their hands and that you now have it in your hand.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I suppose you could argue that someone made the iPhone with their hands as well. But
indeed, and what is the experience of those people like? That's another thing that we should absolutely hold on to.
Right. And so maybe that's where the empathy comes in, is that this is like there is, you can think about all the physical intelligence and skill that was put into this, and you hope that someone enjoyed making it, and that there's a difference as a human feeling empathy when you're using this thing, as opposed to when you're using this one, that it does contain an immense amount of human intelligence, but it also contains some kind of suffering. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just indulging myself in a little bit of too much.
It seems like there's a kind of interesting set of objections being raised in the chat, which maybe we should engage with, by Tib and Larry and Sandra. I don't know if any of them want to actually say something, or if we have the technology to allow them to say something.
Yeah, we do. Let's just pick someone, maybe. Do you want to pick someone, Glenn, and we'll just ask them to unmute themselves, and then we'll go through. Everyone will get a chance, but one at a time, perhaps.
Well, I think Tib was the first person to raise this line of thinking, which I think is really interesting and important. So I want to.
I've unmuted myself. Did it work for everyone?
Hello.
Okay. Well, it's always interesting to me when, those comparisons are created, and kind of going back to farm skills.
Mm-hmm.
The skills that let us do what we're doing right now are the skills a lot of 13-year-olds have. They're kind of the farm skills of the future.
Yeah.
So I was just kind of spinning out the comparison that you were creating. And I think it's something that can be mined. It's not an objection at all. And I love the idea of material intelligence. I think it applies very broadly. So, yeah, my objection it's not even an objection, it's an observation.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And a lot of what I'm, well, I'm always at pains to say that this is meant to be a both and contribution, not an either or.
Yeah.
So I keep saying I don't want to come off as some kind of anti-technological Luddite. I think there is out there in the social universe, I do think that there is a presumption that smart technology has a kind of inherent superiority, and also that I noticed that Sandra said that user friendliness is a kind of empathy, which is true. And you might think about ergonomics as a kind of embodied empathy, for example. I guess I would just say that a lot of these devices and the particular ways in which they are interactive seem to me mainly about suppressing friction. In other words, having the smoothest glide path between you and the functionality of the object. And a lot of that has to do with a kind of stripping away, even physically, of this thing, right? But also a kind of fantasy of control and power and a dehumanization that comes along with that. So I would want to create some space there for a kind of critique of contemporary technology. So as well as saying, yes, it's amazing that we can talk over Zoom right now, and that it's great that we can have both that and the coffee mug at the same time, which is what I'm doing, obviously. I also do think we should be highly alert to the distorting effects that this technology has on our politics, on our daily life. Just the kind of reality of perpetual distraction alone, I think, is really, really pernicious. And so there is also an element in which I want to embrace what I might call craft values as having at their heart a kind of dedicated, caring focus on materiality that really does push back against some of the things that are problematic in our culture right now. So there,
yes,
critique, yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks, Tib. How about, does anyone, I guess rather than, oh, someone raised their, is that Nancy? Nancy Selvin, you want to unmute yourself? I actually can see you on my screen, which is amazing.
Hi, everybody.
Nancy.
Hi. I wanted to go back to the very beginning, and it connects with what Tib just said, is this idea of farm skills and land skills. I had a student a couple years ago, and his family were all farm workers in the Central Valley. Mm-hmm. And so here he is at CCA at art school. And his family would argue with him, like, why are you going to art school? You can repair cars, you can plant, you can cook. He could build, he could do construction. He was also very adept with technology. But they really questioned the value of him doing artwork because he already had this huge skill set of working with his hands. And it was a real push-pull for him. I mean, I'm not being critical of anything. I'm just bringing this up in relation to your great aunt. But it was a terrible push-pull for him between the family saying, look, you can do all these things. What do you need to go and, make mugs or whatever at school? And it was an interesting dilemma. And so sometimes I think a lot of this is a class disconnect, because my friends' kids, my kids, they don't question that kind of interest, to want to go to art school, and their families don't question it.
Yeah, I mean, well, for one thing, just for what it's worth, I didn't mention this, but my great aunt Gail, the one with the pig, she did stay a farmer all of her life, and then late in life, she took up china painting, really Rookwood style china painting,
which of course kind of came out of those basements in the rural
totally.
America. That's where I started doing ceramics in Iowa in a basement. Doing china painting.
Yeah, she lived in California, but you can take the girl out of Kansas, but not vice versa, right? So, but you're raising a great point there. I guess there is an inherent tension, obviously, in the question of how you want to spend your life. Obviously, an artist has a set of objectives in mind that are quite specific and quite different from the general omnicompetent artisan. And I would never want to conflate those two things, because I do have a very high regard for artists and what they do professionally. My own partner is an artist. She's a painter. And I would never want to, kind of smooth over the specific difficulties and challenges of being an artist. What I would say in relation to the story you just told is that the number of skills that that person had would definitely make him a better artist.
Well, it made him a very good student.
Yeah, and it's because it's all capability. It's the same thing for the individual that it is for the community, as I was saying earlier when we were talking about the masks. And I guess to me, it's sort of like, this is a total cliche, but the fact that Picasso knew how to draw made it extremely powerful when he de-skilled the process of making the figure. And of course, he invented a new kind of drawing in the process. And he could not have done that if he weren't already a very skilled draftsman. Now, that is a total cliche. But if you then transport that idea into skills in general, which is not something that we tend to do very often, you realize that, for example, the best so-called sloppy craft, another term that I have some responsibility for proliferating, the best sloppy craft is done by properly trained craftspeople, not by people who have no other option.
Well, I think also with this student is that his social background, his family background also gave him tremendous depth to bring to the work that he was doing, because he had this huge heritage of farm worker tradition. His family went back in California a long time. And, and nobody had ever gone to college until he did. And it gave him a lot of storytelling ability to bring to his work.
Hey, I just noticed a good question from Jen Scanlon. Jen, is it okay? Jen Zwilling, is it okay if we go to Jen Scanlon next?
Yeah, and in fact, I think hers really ties well into what the comment Layla made. And
Layla.
Yeah, I think everyone. So Jen, go ahead and unmute yourself, and Layla too, if you want to both talk.
Okay. Well, I was just.
I agree with you, by the way.
We're having a discussion about how amazing crafted objects in specific are. It really reminds me of sort of the William Morris fundamental problem of the arts and crafts movement, is that this kind of crafting is a privilege, right? When you're looking at it from that perspective, that farm labor is brutal. That many of the people in this country who are involved in farm labor, and for that point, who are involved in hand making, and the people who are making iPods, the people who are making a lot of the clothes in our country who are involved in hand labor are in fact very poor, often communities of color. And so I was hoping Glenn could, from this perspective, looking back at the history and then looking at sort of economic and race differences today, how this idea kind of reflects that reality.
Yeah, it's such an important and crucial question. And I think I might even say in the book that I'm just finishing now, it's the central question, the one that you're using now. And there's so many different examples you could point to. Maybe one of the most clear cut is the question of African-American vocational education after the Civil War. So there you have this debate that ultimately comes to be symbolized in the disagreement between W.B. Du Bois on the one hand and Booker T. Washington on the other. And some of you may know this history, but what it boils down to is that Washington came to be identified with a kind of accommodationist approach to post-Reconstruction racist America, where he thought, okay, what we have to do is teach young African Americans marketable skills. And because they're not going to be able to get white collar jobs, we need to teach them artisanal trades. So Hampton Institute was the first one, and Booker T. Washington's own Tuskegee Institute, and then many, many other schools, especially in the South, but not only, proliferated teaching these young African American kids carpentry and farming skills and woodworking, and ultimately when cars came along, automobile repair, and for girls it was always sewing and baking, domestic arts. And then Du Bois and other reformers came along and said, this is insane, because if we're only teaching African Americans manual skills, they're always going to stay an underclass. And Washington's rejoinder to that was, well, in Jim Crow South, this is the best we can do. And Du Bois would say, well, then we've given up already. And that it's a heart-rending debate, of course. And you can see it also happening in Native American education, and generally speaking, the question of how reservations should function economically. And it also, similar sets of questions come to be applied to women as they enter the workforce as well. And so you have this, exactly as you say, this kind of Janus-faced complex problem that really rotates around the question of whether craft is a means of uplift or if it's a means of repression. And when the arts and crafts movement enters the picture, William Morris, there's this kind of other quite idealist concept that's put into the frame, which is joy in labor, which is a non-economic set of values. And that's the one that the craft movement kind of takes to heart and propels through the 20th century. And I see that as a real kind of dividing of the ways between the social project of craft on the one hand and the art project of craft on the other. And it's very hard for them to get together again. And of course, labor unions have to be brought into that conversation as well. So I know that's kind of a long answer, but it's just to say that the particular thing that you're pointing out to is one of, if not the most thorny problems in American craft history in particular. And it's also, by the way, partly because America has never had a proper social movement. So, you know, we never had a revolution against capitalism the way that many countries did in the 19th century. And so it's been worked out in these other ways that are often circulating around craft.
And I'll just quickly, before I know other people have their hand, Larry has his hand up, but I just wanted to point out, I know it's backwards again, but Crafting Dissent is a book that just recently came out, and there's a chapter called The Anti-Craft Activism of Enslaved Americans, Conspicuous Consumption as Resistance. So to Jen's point, like, this is something we're not talking about at this moment, but there's this idea that in response perhaps to the Washington Du Bois debate, there was a movement to say, like, I don't want to make stuff, I want to buy stuff because that indicates my social value. And of course this happened in every community. I think post-Depression and post-World War II, white Americans were having the same kinds of turning towards conspicuous consumption and buying consumer goods and buying like boxed cake mix and things like this because it indicated your social and financial value. And that's part of, I think the moment that we're in now, that we kind of need to turn or have a desire to turn back to craft because there was this like strong shift away. Anyway, but of course it's all of these things are swirling around and true and not true at the same time. And I'll stop talking and let Larry talk because he had his hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself, Larry?
Yes, thank you. I just wonder if you see the irony in looking back to your relative who was the big cutter for teen. Someone else mentioned it as well. This young girl, I'm sure, had little leisure time, whatever farm she was on. So anything she was doing was there to help the farm survive. She didn't have the time to knit or bake clay pots. Now, as our society progressed, the reason we have all this leisure is that there was the Industrial Revolution, and we've got mechanical washing machines and boxed cake mixes and automobiles and computers and everything else. You know, if we were back in farm times, none of us would be here at all. We'd be out in the field or dead, you know, because it's hard work. So, you know, looking back to the idyllic time, which I don't think was much really idyllic for the farm people who actually did it, you know, I'm wondering if you see the irony there, that we're only here to be able to go to our clay studios and order clay and tools and every glazes and chemicals and things because we have the time and the resources to do it.
Yeah, it reminds me of a great point that had never occurred to me before writing the book, which was that the most powerful technology of uplift in the early 20th century was electrification, not because it permitted time-saving technology so much, although that was part of it, but because simply people could read at night, because the nighttime hours were the downtime. Of course, as you're describing, there was no time during the day that wasn't spent on essentially survivance, you know, building the repertoire of the farm and getting the crop out. So that's quite true. I guess what I'm saying is not so much intended to idealize the farm where my ancestors worked. It's just to notice that the trade-off has been real. So that at the same time that we have gained a lot in terms of time and a lot of freedom of all kinds from technology, we've also lost touch with some things that I think were very spiritually and emotionally and psychologically sustaining. And, you know, it certainly is true that my grandfather, and I quote him to this effect in the book, my grandfather said that the day he left the farm was one of the happiest days of his life, and he kind of never looked back. So that's true. But on the other hand, and maybe this was the contradiction in him, he always, especially in later life, looked back to those farm years as formative for him, and he credited them with everything he achieved later. So, you know, I think it's, as with so many of these questions, it's not a perfectible situation. It's a series of trade-offs. And what I'm encouraging is simply that we be more aware of the trade-offs that we have been making and continue to make.
Yeah, I would totally agree with Glenn, and thanks, Larry, for pointing that out, because I don't want to suggest that I'm idealizing that life on the farm, that it's somehow better than what we have now, but that because we have the privilege of being where we are, we can sort of maybe find a better balance in one way, that we can, as Glenn was saying, kind of see the value and aspects of those things and kind of bring them back into our lives. And also that, you know, those of us who are old enough to remember how life was before the internet and how life was before lots of other things that have changed, are, I guess I feel like a heavy responsibility to sort of be the bearer of that for the next generation, because as things change, the next generation doesn't know what it was like before. So it's not this like, you know, leaving something bad behind for something better. It's that there is no remembrance of what it was like to have to look in the encyclopedia to look something up, and that there are, or to go into a library and browse the stacks instead of just looking in the computer database, and that there's not that we have to go back to those things, but that we should just be able to acknowledge the value of some of them and sort of like find ways in our new reality to bring those positive things along with us as we move forward, I guess. Does that make more, hopefully that makes more sense. I think we're getting close to being done, but I just want to look over in the comments to see if there are any other
I did think Layla raised a really important point about the mask making, which maybe brings us back to the present moment. That might be a good way to finish.
Great. Layla, do you want to unmute yourself and just say what your comment said?
So last week, the ACC hosted a discussion, and Naomi brought up a really interesting point that, once again, artists and women are giving away labor to construct PPE and masks, while our capitalist system is shipping PPE to the highest bidder. And I just wonder if you had any further comment on that, and what, after this crisis, that might mean to campaign for more, not shop local, but local production, and what that means for artists and makers in our communities.
Yeah. So that's such an important question. And I actually heard exactly the same thing from Stephanie Sayuko when I talked to her about it. She's been very involved in the mask making effort out in San Francisco also. So it's great to kind of raise that flag. What to say about it beyond the fact that it's true? I guess maybe one observation I would make is that craft has so often been in the position of ameliorating the ills of capitalism. And in that context, this seems like just another example. So it's like where the brutality or dehumanization of capitalism, that on the one hand, as Larry was just saying, has produced all this freedom. And Sam just made a great point, which is that in some ways we should be thanking history for putting us in the position of being able to choose between these different options, because so many people don't have that choice. Well, still today, of course, but also in the past. But there, in this sort of handmade PPE movement that sprung up overnight, you see this kind of compensatory structure that often arises in craft history, where the hand makers are the ones who rush into the gaps that capitalism has been unable to service because there's not enough profit motive or not enough flexibility. And it's problematic, but it's a problem that has a lot of precedence.
I think there is, if we were willing, or artists, I should say, were willing to capitalize, that's not the question. It's like they're being called to duty in a way, and they are eager to fill it.
Yeah.
I guess just as an addition, I was on a call last week with the Urban Manufacturing Alliance, and Made in NYC said that they were pretty much a direct result of the 9/11 crisis and disruptions in the supply chain. So I suppose I've just been thinking a lot about how to use this moment to address these problems.
Yeah, well, that's sort of where we began in a way, and I think there's a big question out there as to whether our society will emerge in any way better as a result of the virus panic and the pandemic itself. And I think if it does, then it will precisely be in this area of having a more integrity in terms of local production, consumption, and social structures in general. Because I think it's a real wake-up call to the fact that we're not really operating in a way that's sustainable. And one of the things I've been thinking about is that the coronavirus pandemic is like climate change, just faster. So what's been happening anyway is this completely unsustainable relationship that we have with the planet, which is going to create a lot of problems that won't be exactly like the problems we have now, but will have a lot of similarities. It'll just be a lot slower and a lot harder to undo. And so hopefully there's a kind of wake-up call that's happening now because of what everyone is experiencing and not experiencing. And I do think that craft has a really crucial role to play in that context in the future. And hopefully it will be one of the things that people gravitate to as we all climb out of this pit together,
Yeah. I have hope that we'll find the gems of what we can use to move forward in a really positive way out of this. It's kind of what keeps me going at this moment. I'm trying not to be pessimistic about everyone just like snapping back to the way it was before without any thoughtfulness. But let's just all kind of, that's why this is such a great conversation to have today, Glenn. Again, thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for joining us, because I think the more we think about how we can find ways to move forward positively, the more likely it is that it's going to happen. So,
Amen.
Again, I'm just totally overwhelmed that we had more than 100 people here. So excited. Please join us for future events. In 2 weeks, we're going to be talking with Joshua Hebert, who has an exhibition at the Clay Studio right now, which is, you can peek out through the window if you walk by. And I just want to give Glenn one more chance to say it's Craft in American History is the book, and then the exhibition, Glenn?
So the exhibition is called Crafting America, and that's going to be happening at Crystal Bridges. It was originally scheduled for October. It's probably going to get pushed back a little bit, but we're still working on that. But it'll be coming out in the next 12 months sometime.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks so much again for your time, and thank you, everyone. Feel free to email or chat in other ways. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.